Good morning, students. This lecture is for March 31st or April the 1st, whichever U.S. history class you're in. Hope you're well and keeping safe. As we were discussing FDR and his efforts toward dealing with the Depression, we were looking at some of the many acts that he did during 1933 and the flurry of things that Congress passed. The last thing we discussed was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And of course, the purpose of this was to separate commercial banking from investment banking, but it also insured individual depositors. Those that had lost money to the collapse of the banks had lost their money. It was gone. They never had a chance of recouping it. Hopefully, the movement like this would have helped insure people, and as a result of this, the banking crisis will actually improve in the United States. Well, in another move, when the stock market crashed in 1929, there was very little government oversight whatsoever. And so we're going to pass the Securities Exchange Act of 1933, and this is going to regulate the sale of stocks and bonds. There will be a second act to follow in 1934 that will actually establish a governmental commission to help overlook this. And this will enforce the new laws and regulations concerning the trade in the stock market. Next, Roosevelt convinced Congress to pass an Emergency Economy Act, and this would allow him to cut government workers' salaries, reduce payments to military veterans, and cut back on some non-service connected disabilities, and reorganize federal agencies in order to reduce government expenses. Now, what he was going to try to do here was actually get rid of some redundant jobs. Then this will bring about, he wanted federal tax revenues on the sale of alcoholic beverages, so the 21st Amendment will be passed, and this will, of course, do away with the amendment that had brought about prohibition. And so alcohol sales will become legal once again, and the United States government can receive tax money off of this. Now, Hoover had stubbornly refused to help the unemployed and the homeless. Now, Roosevelt was much more flexible. So he's going to have a whole new series of programs that he's going to call, quote, the welfare state. He did not believe individuals should be given cash by the government, called a dole, but he did want the government to help people get jobs. So, Congress will create the Civil Works Administration, and this will put people to work on a government payroll at competitive wages. 4 million federal jobs will be given to those who were unable to find work, and they will repair some 500,000 miles of roads. They will lay new sewer lines, constructing or improving more than 1,000 airports, 40,000 public schools, providing 50,000 teaching jobs, and helping keep small public rural schools open. So it was a tremendous act, and it in part helped the country by working on infrastructure, and it in part helped the country by putting people to work. Sadly, in the spring of 34, he will order this dissolved, and those 4 million workers will again be unemployed. Now, the most successful of the New Deal programs to provide jobs will be called the Civilian Conservation Corps. They will pick up where that other group had ended. They will build roads, bridges, campgrounds, fire towers, fish hatcheries, parks. They'll plant trees. They'll teach farmers how to do and deal with erosion. They will give food, shelter, and clothing and a small wage to the people who work for them. And so this will be a very good program for many American people. He will have a Homeowners Loan Act and a Homeowners Loan Corporation. And these will help people who have not lost their homes yet refinance their mortgages at lower interest rates and avoid bankruptcy and thereby losing their home. Owning one's home has pretty much always been considered the American dream, and others will actually receive land grants as a part of their service in some of these various jobs that Roosevelt is coming up with. And so all of this is to help people get settled once again. And then we've got to work on industry. And so the National Industrial Recovery Act will pass. And what Roosevelt will do here is work with groups of business leaders to establish industry codes and standards. And again, they will be involved in the construction of government buildings, highways, bridges, dams, port facilities, sewer facilities, and so on. The National Recovery Administration will come along and set workplace standards. And one of those is going to be the 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, and the abolition of child labor. So, as you see, in a very, very bad time, in a very, very difficult time, a lot of good things are attempted to help get the American people back on their feet and going once again. The Agricultural Adjustment Act will raise prices for crops and herds, and it will do so by getting farmers to cut back on production. And by the way, this would only benefit those who actually owned their own property. And then there are some regional things. A lot of dams were being built for hydroelectric power. One of those is going to be the Tennessee Valley Authority. It is going to be a tremendous project. Dams are going to be built up and down the Tennessee River for hydroelectric generation. These dams will help control floods. And there are going to be regions of Tennessee that all the way into the 1930s still did not have electricity that will ultimately begin to get electricity into their areas, especially some areas of rural Appalachia and so on. So, all of this turns around then and begins to give Americans a new sense of faith that we're going to come through this and we're going to work this thing out. Now, Roosevelt had a tremendous help. He had help in his wife, Eleanor. She's going to become one of the most active first ladies in all the history of the United States. And she's going to begin a crusade that is going to be in behalf of women, blacks, and young people. She is going to become a very outspoken activist and be, quite honestly, a tremendous help and boom to the president himself. Now, Roosevelt is going to tend to be loved by a lot of people simply because he tended to fight for the common people. But there are going to be others who hated him. And this is especially going to be business leaders and political conservatives who believed the New Deal and the higher taxes it required were moving America toward socialism. Now, all of these programs did not restore prosperity to the United States, nor did they totally end the widespread suffering that was going on. And ever how progressive Roosevelt was on social issues, he actually showed little interest in African Americans at that time. And so many of the New Deal programs actually discriminated against them. But from relentless pressure from Eleanor, the president did appoint more African Americans to government positions than had ever been done before. Okay, a lot of court cases are going on. There is one very famous one of a court case that is called the Scottsboro Boys. And yes, we're talking about Scottsboro, Alabama, down here just to the south of us. An all-white jury on very flimsy evidence convicted 9 young men ranging from 13 to 21 of raping 2 white women while riding on a railroad train. Now, as it turned out, the young women had been willing to sell themselves, but no case up until that time had ever produced so many trials, appeals, reversals, retrials, and was very, very much publicized throughout the country. And ultimately, the Supreme Court overturned the original convictions. And finally, the state of Alabama dropped the charges against the 4 youngest young men and granted paroles to the other. Now, the Great Depression was horrific for Native Americans because they being on the reservations, they were pretty much going to be the last individuals of any group of people that were wound up getting any kind of benefits. And so there will be a Bureau of Indian Affairs established. And it will be designed, and here's a reversal, to reinvigorate Native American cultural traditions by restoring land to the tribe and giving them the right to start businesses and self-governing constitutions and provide federal funds for vocational training and economic development. This will help a little bit, very little bit, but it will help some. Now, as a result, we noted already that earlier the African Americans had begun to desert the Republican Party and turn to the Democratic Party. Well, Native Americans and African Americans are going to vote in large majorities for Roosevelt. And the most prominent threat to Roosevelt came from Louisiana's Democratic Senator Huey Long. And he launched his own presidential candidacy, and he wanted to call his great campaign the Share the Wealth Society. And another critic is going to be a retired California doctor, Francis Townsend. And a third outspoken critic is actually going to be a Catholic priest who had a radio program. And he will actually assail Roosevelt as being anti-God and claim that the New Deal was a communist conspiracy to destroy the United States. So, as popular among those who got benefits as the New Deal was, it had some serious opposition, and among the greatest came from the Supreme Court that had been mostly Republican appointed. So the Supreme Court is going to kill the National Industrial Recovery Act. It's going to declare the Agricultural Adjustment Act's tax. That is not constitutional as well. And so basically the Supreme Court is going to come along and slowly but surely grind the New Deal to a halt. So as Roosevelt comes along in January 1935, he launches a second phase of the New Deal. And what he wants to do is confront economic security, and he will use the radio to take his message directly to the American people. He will conduct what are called fireside chats. Basically, he'll get on the radio every week and talk with the American people. And so we have another 100 days come along, and he will convince the Democratic-controlled Congress to pass most of the second New Deal's must legislation. He will have a Works Progress Administration. This will become the nation's largest employer, hiring an average of 2 million people annually for over 4 years. It will hire writers, artists, authors, musicians, and it will start a massive cultural program in the United States. Of course, in a time of depression, it seems like the arts get thrown to the perimeter. And so Roosevelt, realizing this and seeing a need here, wants to put these people back to work. And so he does so. We will have the National Labor Relations Act. It's called the Wagner Act, and it will guarantee workers the right to organize in unions and bargain directly with management about wages and other issues. This is why the Democratic Party is going to be recognized as being so pro-union. And even today, most unions are going to generally lean toward the Democratic Party as a result of this. Now, we've got to address the old, the blind, the disabled. And so in 1935, Roosevelt is going to propose the Social Security Act. Now, this is the American version of the European welfare state. It is a radical 180-degree departure from anything the government had ever done in this country before. And in its early stages, Again, this is assailed as being purely communist, purely socialist. But when compared with the systems that existed in Europe, this was a very conservative system. It was the only government managed retirement program in the entire world financed by taxes on the earnings of the workers themselves. In other words, money was taken out of each paycheck and put into this system. It enabled, of course, it pinched the poor more than the rich, obviously, and it actually hurt Roosevelt's efforts to revive the economy because it took quite a few funds out of circulation because people had to pay their taxes, and so they didn't have that money to throw into the economy and help out there. But he wanted people to fund their own Social Security pensions because he wanted these Americans from that time, and of course we still have Social Security today, to view their retirement checks not as a welfare payment, but as what would be called an entitlement. Something they had paid for, something they worked for, something they deserved. And so, unlike the European system, where it was a system of governmental, we're just going to give something to you, the American workers will have an investment in this particular act. Okay, the Revenue Act will raise taxes on annual income above $50,000. That is on large fortunes, on corporate profits, and so on. And so Roosevelt doesn't try to raise tax on the poor, the working, and so on, just on those who would have an opportunity at that time to be able to pay more taxes. The labor union movement, of course, because of his support, will really gain momentum during this time. You will have 1 million workers in mass production. Industries will begin to mobilize, and what is going to take place? We finally have the government, instead of just backing big business, which the Republicans had basically done, we now have government backing the workers. Because obviously, if you think about it, if you don't have workers, you can't have industry. And so the government gets behind the workers. The United Mine Workers will organize using the Wagner Act. Unionists will form a committee for industrial organization, and this is the CIO. This is part of the largest union movement in America. The AFL, American Federation of Labor, and the CIO will ultimately merge together and become a most powerful labor organization and a very influential labor organization. Although in 1934, there will be as many as 2,000 strikes across the United States. And that is only slightly behind what we saw in 1919 following World War I. So there is an ambitious program for federal action to shield Americans from social insecurity and economic. So we're going to try to protect Americans. The CIO's major drives are going to be in the automobile and steel industry. And the automobile industry is going to adopt an interesting form of strike. Since strikes tend to be violent at times and require either police or military intervention, what the auto workers are going to do is stage sit-downs. They're just going to take periods when they quit working. Sit down for a while. Nothing violent, nothing threatening. They're not out picketing in front of the buildings. They just simply bring about a slowdown or even a screeching, grinding halt. And so, as a result of this, many of the automakers are going to wind up signing contracts with the United Automobile Workers. And this is going to be a victory that literally reverberates throughout industrial America. And obviously it will give a huge, huge, huge boost to what's going on in trying to rebuild the country. Alfred Langdon of Kansas, who was a progressive Republican, and who quite honestly supported many of the New Deal programs, will go up against Roosevelt in the 1936 election, and Roosevelt will literally carry every state except Maine and Vermont. So you talk about a landslide. This is a landslide. Democrats would dominate the new Congress, 77-19 in the Senate, and 328-107 in the House. President Roosevelt's going to make strong gains in the West, and of course they're going to benefit from the agricultural deals. In the northern cities, he'll hold on to the ethnic groups who were helped by many of the New Deal policies. So, after 1936, Roosevelt actually becomes bolder and, according to your textbooks, at times even reckless. And considering the conservative bent of the court and so on, he viewed the court as literally standing in his way. And so he will get so upset with the Supreme Court without consulting anyone. He will go to Congress and ask them to name 6 new Supreme Court justices. Now, this is called court packing by many, and it backfired royally, except it apparently got the Supreme Court's decision. And they began to back off of their strong anti-New Deal opposition and began to more and more support some of the programs that the president was coming up with. They had a new willingness, shall we say, for economic reevaluation. But all of this comes as the pace of the second New Deal actually begins to slow down as well. So, 35-36, there's a little sign that recovery is coming. Then in 1937, Roosevelt has to order some sharp cuts in spending, and the economy just stalled and then slid into a business slump that in many respects was actually worse than 1929. We have loans being made through the Farm Act, though, and I think this is very interesting, to some of those tenant farmers, those sharecroppers, those people that had gotten totally left out following the American Civil War. And some of these individuals are actually able to obtain loans and buy a piece of property for themselves, which was a really, really neat thing and was beneficial for not only people in the West, but a lot of people in the Deep South. By the late 1930s, the Democrats were beginning to split into two factions. You had the very conservative Southern people and the more liberal Northerners. And this faction is going to remain through the 40s, into the 50s, into the 60s. It is not going to go away. Now, that doesn't mean people in the South won't vote for Roosevelt, but these Southern senators especially are going to drag their feet on a lot of things that they view as being too liberal for their taste. Okay, so the momentum of the New Deal just basically fizzles by 1939. But the world has changed. Japan was advancing in Asia. By 1939, they had already invaded China and were showing their interest in other Asian territories. Germany will attack Poland in 1939 and will begin advancing through Europe. And so, as attention has been on America, what's going on in America, trying to help America, suddenly Roosevelt's got to take his attention away from simply domestic problems and realize there are going to be some greater world problems out there. Now, definitely, as we think about Roosevelt's presidency to this point, he changed the role of the federal government in national life. The federal government assumed responsibility for planning and managing the economy and intervening to ensure social stability. So this is a huge, huge change. But the greatest failure of the New Deal was its inability to restore prosperity and end the record levels of unemployment. So it did not curb the Depression. Only World War II would finally produce full employment once again. So, this ends our section where we will have our second test. So let's talk about that a moment before we begin the next section. Number one, we will not pause class time for tests, so you will take these on your own. Number two, because we have had to change our format so much and obviously can't do our typical test reviews, your test will consist of 5 essay questions. And these 5 essay questions will be open book, open note. So, begin to put your notes and thoughts together. We will put the test up online under Dropbox this week, and I need you to be able to start taking these tests as soon as possible. Okay, moving on. We start new material for test number 3. And as we think about the build-up to World War II, there are a lot of directions we can take, a lot of things we can say. As Japan begins its march, as Germany begins its march, the isolationists in the United States start singing their song very, very loudly again. They don't want anything to do with a European or an Asian war. Now, unfortunately for the United States, we are going to be drawn into this war, in some respects kicking and screaming, but we are going to be drawn into this war. Now, let me say something. We talked about eugenics. World War II is a racist war. The Nazis are going to create a racist myth. They are going to talk about a group of people that actually did exist in the ancient world, the Aryans. Of course, they're going to make something out of the Aryans that they were not. And the Nazis are going to determine that they are the superior race people in Europe. And because they are destined, scientific racism, Darwinism, to rule Europe. And they're going to sell this myth to their people. You know, I think there's a funny shattering of the myth, and I really would love to know what Hitler thought about. Germany will host the 1936 Olympics, and of course the Nazi Party was already in existence at that time. In the 100-meter dash, there is a young black American by the name of Jesse Owens. Now, in Hitler's sight, Jesse Owens is going to be considered a person of inferior race. He will totally destroy, time-wise, the two best German athletes. And in the 200 meters, he'll actually turn around to shake hands with the second-place guy. He destroyed them. And of course, Hitler will very conspicuously refuse to present Jesse Owens with his medals. He'll have some kind of excuses as to why he cannot do that. But you really wonder what was going through his mind as his so-called superior race athletes are totally destroyed by this so-called inferior race athlete. So that is, one interesting thought of the war. But let's talk about Hitler a little bit. He is an interesting character. In World War I, he was actually only a corporal. He was not actually German. He was Austrian. But he had a philosophy. And his philosophy was one that worked well for him. His idea was, if you tell people something long enough, loud enough, and convincing enough, you can make them believe that hell is heaven. And he sold the German people a lie. First, he creates his myth of superiority. Second, he creates a scapegoat, the Jewish people. He blames them for Germany's loss in World War I. And so you've got a superiority attitude. You've got somebody that you can blame and supposedly kick like the cat. And so you hammer. Look what they did to us. Look how they treated us. And of course, all of these are references to the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. So Hitler hammered away. And where European imperialism had died out somewhat at the end of World War I, Hitler totally revives it. He wants to do to Europe what Napoleon was not able to fully accomplish. And Hitler really will come close. And of course, in Japan, again, their imperialistic ideas and their search for more industrial resources will send them expanding far beyond their island. And of course, many individuals are going to pay a tremendous price as a result of this. Okay, so what we have It's the United States, when it is attacked by Japan, being shaken in a way that it was never shaken before. Now, supposedly, the United States was supposed to be informed of the attack roughly an hour before it actually commenced. But the two Japanese ambassadors had trouble translating the coded message, and so they actually did not deliver the declaration of war against the United States until after the attack had taken place. Now, the attack was decimating. Most of the battleships that were stationed in the Pacific were either destroyed or heavily damaged. Over 3,000 Americans were killed. And it's quite fortunate 2 of the U.S. Pacific aircraft carriers were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor that day, and they were late on arriving. And had they been there, they probably would have been destroyed. And it could well have been that the war would have almost been won in that one effort strike. Now, the one major mistake the Japanese made was not attacking the oil reserves that were at Pearl Harbor. Those remained intact. So at least we've got fuel for ships when we're able to get ships back out in the water again. So Pearl Harbor was really, really close. And yet the Japanese commander made a most interesting discovery. As his officers are celebrating this great victory as they're headed back, his comment is that he was afraid all they had done was awaken a sleeping giant and filled him with resolve. And he will find out, or Japan at least will find out, just how correct that evaluation actually was. Now, as we look at World War II, unlike World War I, we're going to have entire cities destroyed. We're going to have nations dismembered. We're going to have societies transformed. World War II is going to be total war in every sense of the word, in that nations and armies are going to turn their attention not just on armies in the field, but on civilians in the cities. London, Berlin, other places are going to be bombed, and civilians are going to suffer tremendously. Now, America is going to be jarred out of its isolationism, and when it comes out of isolationism, America will never be the same again. It will come out of World War II as the most powerful nation in the world. And it will never again retreat into isolationism. It will have a new mission to have an international role and help those who are opposed to communism and oppose those who support communism. Actually, during World War II, and this may surprise you, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. But almost immediately at the end of the war, those two allies are going to begin to look at each other with tremendous suspicion, and we will go into a period that is generally called the Cold War. And there will be a military buildup and standoff between these two superpowers in the world. Now, let's look at Europe, because Europe is kind of the hotbed of where World War II is going to arise. Soviet communism is on the march during the 20s and 30s, and so is its ideological opponent, fascism. Now, fascism is a totalitarian government that uses a dictator. It uses propaganda. It uses brute force and tries to control all aspects of national life. And fascism will arise both in Germany and in Italy. Italy really felt disappointed in the way it was treated after World War I. And so this time they decide to align themselves with the Germans. Now, Germany and the Nazi Party had what we can call an ultra-nationalist patriotism. You were either for them or against them. And brutality was used not only against the Jews and minorities, but it would be used against the German people. In other words, you submitted, you gave in. And many of these Nazi leaders are going to become totally intoxicated with power. And they are going to be brutal individuals. Some that are caught following the end of World War II will actually be tried and executed for war crimes because of the many diabolical and evil things that they did. And of course, we look at the Holocaust and we realize that there were 6 million Jews that died in that. Let's realize there were 7 million others, non-Jewish people, who wound up dying as a result of the Holocaust as well. And these would be minorities, these would be German Catholics, these would be German Protestants. And so the ideology of the Nazis was actually a type of religion. Not a God-centered religion, although early on, the German military belt buckles were stamped with God with us. So they actually somehow, in a warped, twisted way, thought that they were being God's ambassadors. Obviously, they were not. And so the 20s and the 30s become times of political change. They become times of political agitation. And literally, Hitler comes along, and this is one reason I say that Nazism is like a religion. He basically portrays himself as being a German savior. I've come along to redeem you from the suffering of World War I. And so he had a secret police, he had military spectacles, athletic competitions, all of these things to bring the united people of Germany together and put them on a cause that would lead them into war against Europe. He took advantage of the German Depression, and he will start a most interesting form of attack on his enemies. He will have what is called blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg involves airplanes, tanks, and mobile infantry, all in a concerted effort together. And so all of this will bring about the fall of Poland, Czechoslovakia, even all the way into France, because this lightning warfare, as it is called, is going to be very, very devastating indeed. Now, if you want a start of World War II in Europe, it is probably when Italy invades Ethiopia. Now, I want you to see the brutality of this. Italy has airplanes and tanks, and Ethiopia has a horse-mounted cavalry. And so you can imagine how that one ended up. As Hitler is beginning to make his moves, Britain and Germany are so weary from World War I, the last thing they want is another war. They were weak, they were frightened, and basically they practice appeasement. Well, maybe it won't be too bad. Maybe it won't go too far. And in a case of a person like Hitler, you give that person an inch, and they're going to take 1,000,000 miles. And Hitler did. And so his first effort, 1938, he will force the union of Austria with Germany. The U.S. remains silent. Europe says, well, that's okay. They're sort of kind of kin to one another. And so no one at first steps in to stop Hitler in his advances. And so after he brings this union about, he goes into what is called the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia, where a lot of German people lived, and he annexes them, saying he wants to unite all the German people together. He sent German tanks in to conquer then the rest of the Czech Republic. And he does everything he can to try to keep the United States out of the war. Although as Hitler begins his advances, Congress does begin to increase military spending a little bit in anticipation of a possible war. But Congress also passes neutrality acts, and pacifism grew on college campuses. 1939, Hitler takes Poland, and it is a most oppressive conquest. As a result of this, the leaders of Britain and France are forced to take action. So in September of 1939, they honor their commitment to defend Poland, and even though the Nazis will conquer Poland and at the time set up a division of Poland between them and the Soviets, Hitler still has in the back of his mind that he wants to take the Soviet Union. So in 1939, the Soviets will invade Finland, which was one of the new nation states that had arisen after World War I. In April 1940, the Nazis occupy Denmark. From Denmark, it will literally fall in one day. Norway will fall within a few weeks. Germany invades the Low Countries. Luxembourg fell in a day. Netherlands, 4 days. Belgium lasted roughly a month. And so this blitzkrieg is literally taking Europe. And coming out down the coastline, as it were, Germany attacks France. And these fast-moving columns will literally drive the French and British armies all the way to the French coast at the English Channel. And here is one of the most amazing parts about the early World War II saga. The troops are trapped on the beach. They've got nowhere to go. The Germans are coming. And the Germans out-equip them, they out-army them, they out-shoot them. These people are going to suffer horrendous losses, and of course, those that survive are going to wind up in prisoner camps. Well, back in England, average citizens, people who have fishing boats, and not necessarily big fishing boats, but just ordinary British people, are going to rally to the cause. They're going to sail across the English Channel, and they're going to ferry as many of these soldiers as they possibly can off the beaches at Dunkirk. And quite honestly, it is going to be to the chagrin of the German people, but it will be at least a moral victory for the Allies, because those soldiers that are saved off those beaches are going to live to fight another day. And as they are evacuated off of beaches, they are going to come back into France via the beaches to help drive the Germans out of France. So, June 14th, 1940, German armies march down the streets of Paris. And 8 days later, France is surrendered. And Germany owns most of Europe. Oh, Napoleon would have been impressed. So now, basically, what you have is Britain standing alone against Hitler's total power. And Hitler's intention is to actually invade Britain. And so he comes up with a great plan. And what he does is decide he has to destroy Britain's Air Force, have total domination of the air, before he is going to be able to invade the country. There was one problem. Hitler underestimated the British fighter aircraft, the Spitfire, and he underestimated the resolve of the British people. The Spitfire was probably the best fighter aircraft at the beginning of World War II. It was very maneuverable. It had a Rolls-Royce engine. I mean, how much better engine could you have? And of course, realize these British pilots, and of course there were some Polish, there were Americans, there were Czechs, there were several people that were trying to help out a little bit even before the U.S. is in the war. But it is going to be the tenacity of these British fighter pilots that is going to stave the invasion of Great Britain. Now, it is going to be an awful battle. Cities are going to be bombed, but the British have a new technology that helps them immensely. Now, that technology is going to advance tremendously during World War II, but it is called radar. And so, as these German fighter squadrons are coming in, the British radar picks it up. They can tell the various British fighter squadrons where they're coming in, and the British will go out and meet them. And as I say, it is going to be a tremendous fight. Britain stands alone. Toward the end, the commander of the Luftwaffe is actually going to go to the German commander in France and say, you know, we're for you. We want you to win this battle. What is it going to take for you to be able to win this? And the German commander is going to look at his commanding officer and say, I need a squadron of Spitfires. So even the enemy recognized the power and the usefulness of the plane. Now, instead of demoralizing Britain as he had hoped to do, Hitler actually energized the people. And a man with not a great speaking voice, but a man with a tremendous amount of optimism, and one to whom the people could look to and believe in, kept the British people inspired. His name was Winston Churchill. Quite an amazing leader. Now, he and Hitler were as opposite as opposites could be. Churchill was a very religious man. He deeply trusted in God, but Churchill was also a man with some military experience, much more than Hitler had had. And he could encourage the German people onward. Now, to show you how well the British Army did, it is estimated that they destroyed over 1,300 German warplanes. And so by October of 1940, Adolf Hitler had actually given up his plan for the invasion of the British Isles. So what's going on? Is the United States in any way getting ready for what might come along? Now, obviously, we pass a Neutrality Act, but what the United States does is start what is called a Lend-Lease program. In other words, if someone needs U.S. military equipment, especially shipping, in this case, to get supplies, the United States will lend them ships and they can pay for them at a future time. Kind of a slick way to slide into the war, but it helps. But again, the United States does, at the beginning of the war, try to declare itself to be a neutral power. And Hitler probably, after the defeat and not able to take Britain, would probably have been able to live with American neutrality. So it's not going to be Hitler that is actually going to bring the United States into World War II. Hitler's going to leave that to other individuals and other sources. Hitler has a bigger game plan. Though supposedly they are allies with the Soviet Union, in the spring of 1941 and moving onward, the Nazis begin to fight Italian troops in Libya, and the British Army goes to North Africa. Nazi forces will, in 1941, overwhelm Yugoslavia and Greece, and suddenly, in June of 1941, they unleash the Blitz on Russia. Now, Hitler learned something from Napoleon. Don't invade Russia in September. He literally thought he could be able to defeat the Soviet Union before winter set in. And so the Soviet army has a very interesting plan. They retreat. They draw the Germans in, long supply lines and so on. They dismantle buildings. They burn fields and factories. They destroy anything that the Germans might be able to use. And so they drag them in to the point that, yes, winter does come. And Hitler, just as Napoleon had learned, that winter is a tremendous ally for the Soviet people. Now, the Soviet fighters were ferocious. Women will be involved in the Soviet army. And as they bogged down around the city of Stalingrad, it is estimated that over 200,000 people will die in Stalingrad during the winter of 1942. Tremendous losses. But after this winter of 1942, the Soviets, as the spring is beginning to come, are going to have a major surprise for their German invaders. And the Soviets feel they have a whole lot of payback that's due. And so with their payback, it's getting ready to really get serious. But Stalingrad will bog down into street fighting. Snipers will become some of the most effective weapons in all of Stalingrad. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop here. And when we come back next time, we'll begin to pick up as the United States is drawn into this great conflict. And I hope you have a really good day.